What would you do if the one animal everyone called useless was trying to lead you somewhere it refused to forget? In a quiet Montana town in 1886, a lone cowboy thought he had simply bought a broken horse no one else wanted. But from the moment he took it home, the animal began acting like it was carrying a memory too heavy to ignore, pulling toward the forest, refusing to rest, as if something out there was waiting to be found. And when he finally chose to follow it into the trees, he discovered a place no one in town dared to speak about, and a secret that would shake every life in Red Hollow. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. So what exactly was hidden inside that abandoned cabin? And why did the horse need him to see it? Red Hollow, Montana in the year 1886 was the kind of place a man passed through, only if he had nowhere else left to go or nowhere he wished to return. The wind never seemed to stop there. It moved low across the valley, dragging dust along the ground and whispering through the gaps in old wooden walls. Buildings leaned like tired men, their paint long stripped away by years of weather and neglect. Some houses stood empty doors swinging loose on broken hinges, as if their owners had simply walked out one day and never come back. There weren't many people left in Red Hollow. Those who stayed kept to themselves. Conversations were short and questions were unwelcome. Life circled around a few places: the stable, the saloon, and the narrow stretch of road that led in and out of town. And even there were things people avoided talking about. Stories that stopped halfway, names that were no longer mentioned. Ethan Cole lived just beyond the edge of it all. His land sat at the far end of the valley, where the grass thinned and the soil turned hard and cracked. His cabin was small, weathered, and quiet. The fence that bordered his property had more gaps than rails, and the wind moved freely through it, just like everything else. There wasn't much to look at, and that suited him fine. His days were simple, almost identical. He woke with the light, checked what needed fixing, patched what he could, and let the rest wait. He fed the horses, walked the boundary of his land, and spent long stretches of time in silence. He didn't go into town unless he had to. And when he did, he kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and left as soon as he could. Ethan wasn't unfriendly. He just wasn't interested. Not in conversation, not in people, and certainly not in anything new. That was why, when he stepped into Old Man Carter's stable that afternoon, he didn't expect to leave with anything more than feed and supplies. The stable smelled of hay leather and dust. A few healthy horses stood tied in their stalls, shifting calmly, their coats brushed and their eyes clear. But at the far end, away from the others, there was one that didn't belong with the rest. It was tied to a separate post, the rope shorter, tighter. The horse was too thin. Its ribs showed beneath a dull, uneven coat. Its mane hung in rough, tangled strands. But it wasn't weakness that stood out to Ethan. It was the way the animal held itself. Its muscles were tight coiled beneath its skin and its eyes. Its eyes were not tired or dull. They were alert, watching everything. Even the other horses kept their distance. None stood too close to its side of the stable. They shifted away from it without being told, as if they could sense something in it they didn't trust. Carter noticed where Ethan was looking and let out a dry chuckle. "That one," the old man said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Ain't worth the trouble." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stepped a little closer, slow enough not to startle it. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. Carter shrugged. "Plenty. Don't listen. Don't settle. Spooks at things that ain't there." He paused, then added, "Nearly broke a man's arm last month. Just snapped. No warning." The horse flicked an ear, but it didn't pull back. It didn't shy away from Ethan the way Carter had suggested it might. Instead, it watched him. Directly, steadily, Why keep it? Ethan asked. Trying to sell it, Carter said. No one's dumb enough to take it, though. Even cheap's too much for that one. Ethan reached out, not quite touching, just letting his hand hover near the horse's neck. The animal tensed, but it didn't strike. It didn't bolt. It just stood there, waiting. It ain't mean, Ethan said quietly. Carter snorted. Give it time. Ethan studied it a moment longer. There was something wrong, yes, but not in the way Carter described. Not wild, not broken. Just strained. I'll take it, Ethan said. Carter blinked. You serious? Ethan nodded once. The old man shook his head, half amused, half relieved. Your money. When Carter untied the rope, the horse didn't fight. It didn't rear or pull away. But it didn't relax either. Its body stayed tight like it was holding something back. Outside the stable, the wind picked up, carrying a faint chill from the north. The horse lifted its head immediately. Its ears turned. Its whole body shifted. And for the first time, it looked away from Ethan, past him beyond the buildings of Red Hollow, toward the distant line of trees at the far edge of the valley. Ethan noticed. He led it forward, but the horse slowed, then stopped. Come on, he muttered, giving the rope a light tug. It resisted not violently, just enough. Then after a moment it moved again. But not willingly. They made their way out of town, slowly. And the farther they went, the more the horse looked back. Every few steps its head turned over its shoulder, eyes fixed on that same direction. The north. The forest. When the wind shifted and blew from that way, the horse reacted instantly. Its ears snapped forward. Its pace faltered. Once it stopped, entirely planting its hooves, as if refusing to go another inch. Ethan clicked his tongue, urging it forward. It obeyed, but only just. At one point it turned almost completely around, pulling against the rope with quiet determination. Not panic, not fear. Something else. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You trying to go back? He murmured. The horse didn't answer, of course. But it didn't need to. By the time they reached his land, the sun was already lowering and the wind had grown colder. At the ranch, Ethan tied the horse near the fence and brought out feed. The other horses approached out of habit, but this one didn't. It stood apart, unmoving. It didn't touch the food. Instead, it faced the same direction it had all the way from town. North. Ethan followed its gaze, but from here the forest was nothing more than a dark line on the horizon. You'll eat when you're hungry, he said, setting the bucket down. The horse didn't move. That night the sound woke him. A steady rhythmic pounding. He stepped outside, boots crunching softly against the dry ground. The horse was awake, wide awake. Its hoof struck the ground again, and again. Not random, not restless shifting, deliberate. Ethan frowned. Easy, he said, stepping closer. The horse's breathing was heavy, uneven. Its sides rose and fell too quickly. Its head was low, but its eyes were wide, fixed on something in the distance. Ethan turned, scanning the darkness. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Still the horse didn't calm. The next night it was worse. And the night after that, worse still. One evening, the rope snapped. The sound cracked through the air as the horse lunged forward, its entire body straining toward the north. Ethan caught it just in time, grabbing the remaining length of rope and bracing himself. The horse didn't rear, didn't kick, it just pulled. Relentlessly. When he finally managed to steady it, the animal stood trembling, its breath coming in sharp bursts. It wasn't fighting him. It was trying to go somewhere. The next morning, Ethan checked its hooves. That's when he noticed the mud. It was packed deep into the grooves, dried, but still clinging, darker than the soil on his land. He scraped some free and rubbed it between his fingers. Wet ground, dense, forest soil. He hadn't taken the horse anywhere near that kind of terrain. His eyes shifted to the saddle. There, beneath the worn leather, was a stain. Old, but not ancient. Browned at the edges. Blood. And along the strap a long tear, not from age, but from force. Like something had yanked it hard enough to rip the stitching apart. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying the horse in silence. "Where'd you come from?" he muttered. Later that day, he went into town. The saloon was dim-filled with low voices and the clink of glasses. But when the door opened and Ethan stepped inside, a few heads turned, not out of curiosity, just habit. He ordered a drink and listened. It didn't take long. "Still no sign of them," someone said from the corner. "Been weeks now. Family just gone like that." Another voice cut in. "Told you not to go near that place." "What place?" A pause. Then quieter northwoods. The table fell silent. Ethan took a slow sip and stepped closer. "What happened out there?" he asked. A few men glanced at each other. One shrugged. "Nothing you need to worry about. A family went missing," another said reluctantly. "Whole lot of them. No tracks, no bodies." "And someone went looking," a third added. "Didn't come back either." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Who?" The man hesitated. "Just someone passing through." At the bar, Carter had gone quiet. Ethan turned to him. "That horse you sold me," he said. "Where'd it come from?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Then slowly he said, "Picked it up outside town." From who? Didn't see anyone. That wasn't true. Ethan could hear it in the way he said it. Across the room, someone was watching him. Not openly. Just long enough to notice. The air felt different now. Heavier. Ethan finished his drink and left without another word. When he returned to the ranch, the horse reacted the moment he stepped into view. Its head snapped up. Its body tightened. And when he spoke just a few words about the forest, the reaction was immediate. The horse jerked its head hooves, striking the ground harder than before. Its ears locked forward, its eyes wide bright. It turned fully toward the north, pulling the rope tight until it hummed with tension. This time Ethan didn't try to stop it right away. He just stood there watching. Thinking. The wind shifted again, carrying that same faint chill from the trees far beyond his land. The horse didn't look afraid. Not anymore. It looked certain. Ethan followed its gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. A thought, quiet but persistent, settled into place. "This ain't fear," he said under his breath. The horse pulled again, steady, insistent. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You're trying to go back." Where do you think the horse is trying to lead, Ethan? And what would you do if you were in his place? Would you follow it into the unknown or turn back before it's too late? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most intense part of the story. The next morning came colder than the ones before it. A thin layer of frost clung to the ground, and the air carried a quiet stillness that felt heavier than usual. Ethan stepped out of his cabin, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath faint in the pale light. The valley looked the same as always, dry, empty, unmoving. But something about it felt different. The horse was already awake. It wasn't pacing this time. It wasn't striking the ground or pulling against the rope. It was standing perfectly still, waiting. Ethan slowed as he approached. The animal's muscles were tight beneath its skin, its head lifted slightly, ears fixed forward, pointed toward the north. "You've been at it all night," he muttered. No answer, just that same rigid stance. Ethan reached for the rope and loosened it. The moment the tension eased, everything changed. The horse surged forward. The force of it caught Ethan off guard, nearly pulling him off his feet. He grabbed the rope instinctively, boots digging into the dirt as the animal lunged ahead. "Easy," he snapped, trying to pull it back. But the horse didn't fight him. It ignored him. It wasn't panicking. It wasn't thrashing. It was moving with direction, straight, fast, and certain. North, the same direction it had been watching for days. Ethan tightened his grip muscles, straining as he tried to check its movement. For a moment he considered forcing it back, dragging it, tying it tighter, putting an end to whatever this was. But something stopped him. This wasn't fear. It wasn't wildness. It was intent. He felt it clearly now in the way the animal moved, not away from something, but toward it. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then instead of pulling back, he let the rope go slack. "All right," he said under his breath. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the saddle and swung himself up onto the horse's back. "I'm following you." The words had barely left his mouth when the horse moved again, faster this time, as if it had been waiting. They crossed the edge of his land in seconds. The familiar dry ground gave way beneath them, the soil darkening as they moved farther from the valley. The grass thinned, then disappeared altogether, replaced by patches of damp earth that clung to the horse's hooves. Ethan didn't guide. He didn't pull. He let the reins rest loose in his hands. And the horse led. The first trees rose ahead of them, tall and narrow, their branches reaching down like fingers. The light shifted as they entered the open sky, fading behind a canopy that grew thicker with every step. The air changed. Cooler. Heavier. The wind that had never stopped in Red Hollow fell away completely. They moved onto a narrow path, barely visible beneath layers of fallen leaves. The ground was soft here, damp enough that each step left a faint imprint, though none looked recent. No wagon tracks, no footprints. Nothing. The horse slowed, not out of hesitation, but caution. Its pace became measured, each step deliberate, its head lowering slightly as it moved deeper into the trees. Ethan leaned forward, ducking under low branches that scraped softly against his coat. Twigs brushed his shoulders. Leaves caught in his hair. He listened. There was nothing. No birds, no insects, no wind. Only the quiet, steady rhythm of hooves pressing into wet leaves. The deeper they went, the more that silence pressed in around them. It wasn't empty, it felt contained, like something was holding the sound back. The horse stopped, without warning. Ethan lifted his head, scanning the trees. "What is it?" he murmured. The horse didn't move. It turned its head slightly, glancing back at him. Waiting. Ethan gave a small nod, barely aware of the gesture himself. "Go on." The horse turned forward again and continued. It happened again. And again. Every so often the animal would halt, look back, and wait until Ethan acknowledged it before moving on. Not fear, not confusion, confirmation. As if it needed to know he was still there, still willing to follow. After a while, Ethan stopped thinking about it. He simply followed. Branches grew thicker overhead. The light dimmed further, turning the world into muted shades of gray and green. The air smelled of damp wood and something older, something untouched. The ground beneath them showed signs of disturbance now. Old depressions, faint, worn shapes pressed into the soil. Hoof prints, not fresh, but not entirely erased either. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he studied them in passing. "Someone's been through here," he muttered. Or something. A broken branch hung at shoulder height, snapped clean. Another lay further ahead, crushed under weight. But there was no pattern he could follow. No clear trail, just fragments. Enough to suggest movement, not enough to explain it. The horse reacted before Ethan could. Its ears shot forward, its body tightening again, but it didn't turn back. It kept going, slow, steady, certain. Eventually, the trees began to thin, not gradually, but all at once. The canopy broke apart and light spilled into a small clearing ahead. The horse stopped at the edge. Ethan lifted his head. There in the center of the clearing stood a cabin. It was old. That much was clear at a glance. The wood had darkened with age, the roof sagging slightly, the structure leaning just enough to suggest years of neglect. But something about it didn't fit. It wasn't abandoned, not entirely. A faint line of smoke rose from the chimney, thin, almost invisible against the pale sky. Ethan stared at it. "No one mentioned this," he said quietly. The clearing was silent. No movement, no voices. Just that cabin. Still, watching. The horse refused to move. Ethan pressed his heels lightly, urging it forward. It didn't respond. He tried again, a little firmer this time. Nothing. The animal stood, its ground muscles locked, head lowered slightly, but eyes fixed on the cabin. It wasn't afraid. But it wasn't going any closer. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said. He swung down from the saddle boots, landing softly on the damp earth. The moment his weight left, the horse shifted, but it didn't retreat. It stayed exactly where it was, as if marking a line it would not cross. Ethan took a step forward, then another. Each movement deliberate, measured. The closer he got, the more the details came into focus. The front door was shut but not secured, in the way a man would lock his home. A chain hung across it, looped through the handle, locked from the outside. Ethan stopped. "That don't make sense," he muttered. "A man didn't lock himself in. And if someone had locked the place up to keep others out, why the smoke?" His gaze shifted to the windows, covered from the inside. No light escaped, no movement showed. But the chimney still breathed that faint, steady line of smoke into the air. Someone was in there, and they weren't leaving. Ethan moved closer to the wall, pressing his shoulder lightly against the rough wood. He listened. At first there was nothing, just the faint crackle of something inside. Then a sound. So quiet he almost missed it. A small broken breath. He froze, leaning closer, pressing his ear against the wall. There it was again. A stifled sob. Not wind, not wood. Human. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Hello," he called softly. No answer. But the sound didn't stop. He moved along the wall, searching until he found a narrow gap where the boards didn't quite meet. He lowered himself slightly, peering through the slit. Darkness. Shapes. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Then something moved. A small figure. Then another. Ethan leaned closer, his breath slowing as the image sharpened. Children, several of them, huddled together, tied. They sat close, shoulders touching, as if trying to make themselves smaller. One of them had their head down, shaking. Another stared toward the door, toward the light, eyes wide and silent. None of them cried out. None of them moved toward him. They were too afraid. Ethan's chest tightened. "Jesus," he whispered. He shifted slightly, trying to see more. The interior came into focus, piece by piece. Ropes around their wrists. Clothes torn and dirty. The floor, he saw the marks then. Long streaks dragged across the wood. Dark stains dried into the grain. Old blood. Ethan pulled back slowly, the weight of it settling in his chest. This wasn't a shelter. This wasn't a place someone had taken refuge. It was a cage. Ethan stayed crouched beneath the narrow gap in the cabin wall for one more heartbeat, then slowly leaned back. The image inside remained burned into his mind, the children huddled together, the ropes around their wrists, the silence that had settled over them. like something alive. He did not turn his back on the door immediately. Instinct kept him careful. Whatever had put those children in there was still close enough to matter. He moved along the wall with slow, deliberate steps, keeping his shoulder low and his boots light against the ground. The wood of the cabin was rough beneath his fingertips. He rounded the back corner and entered a smaller patch of open ground behind the cabin where the earth was softer, darker, and less covered by leaves. That was where he saw them. Hoof prints. Not one or two, but many. They crossed over one another in a churned pattern, some half erased by time, others still holding their shape. A few were old and shallow, softened by damp soil and weather. Others were deeper, sharper, pressed hard into the ground, as if a horse had been driven fast or fought against its rider. Ethan lowered himself to one knee. He studied them without moving at first, letting his eyes adjust to the pattern. Then he reached out and touched one of the clearer impressions with the tips of his fingers. The width, the split along the outer rim, the angle. His jaw tightened. He looked over his shoulder toward the clearing. The horse stood exactly where he had left it, a dark shape at the edge of the trees, head lowered, ears forward, eyes fixed on the cabin. Ethan looked back down at the print. It matched, not roughly, not close enough to wonder. Exactly. A cold line moved through his chest. He rose slowly, staring from the ground to the horse and back again. For a moment, everything around him, the damp earth, the trees, the thin smoke lifting through the branches, seemed to hold still. Then the pieces began fitting together in his mind all at once. The dried blood on the saddle, the torn rein, the way the horse had watched the north from the first moment he had seen it, the way it had struck the ground at night and trembled when the wind came from the forest. It had not just known the way here. It had been here, and not only once. Ethan turned back to the tracks and looked harder. Some of the hoof prints cut away from the cabin and disappeared toward the trees. Others came toward it. But one line of deeper marks set farther apart than the others showed the desperate rhythm of a horse pushed hard. He could almost see it in his mind now. A rider coming fast, a struggle, a horse wrenching sideways, a hand losing the reins, the violent pull that had ripped the leather. He straightened slowly. "The man who went missing," he said under his breath. The words felt different once spoken aloud. More solid, more dangerous. A man had found this place before him. A man had likely ridden this very horse through the trees. He had probably heard the same silence, seen the same smoke, found the same locked door. He had tried to do something about it, and he had never come back. The horse had. Not by accident, not lost, not wandering. It had escaped, and it had carried this place inside it ever since. Ethan's eyes moved once more to the cabin wall, then to the children hidden beyond it. His thoughts raced ahead of themselves. If the missing man had tried to free them, if he had failed, then whoever had done this would not be far. Men who kept children chained inside a cabin in the middle of nowhere did not leave such a place unguarded for long. As if summoned by the thought, a sound cracked through the stillness. A branch snapping somewhere beyond the front clearing. Ethan's head came up at once. Then another sound. Footsteps, several, not scattered like animals, measured, human. He moved fast but carefully, slipping back toward the side of the cabin and angling his body so he could see toward the front without exposing too much of himself. Through the trees at the far edge of the clearing, he caught movement, dark shapes passing between trunks. One man, then another, then a third. They were walking straight toward the cabin with the easy confidence of men who had done it before. None of them hesitated. None looked wary. They were not hunters crossing unfamiliar ground. They belonged to this path. Ethan took one step back, searching for a line of retreat. There wasn't one. The open ground around the cabin offered little cover, and the back side was too exposed to cross without being seen. The trees were close, but not close enough. The men came nearer. One of them stopped. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the side of the cabin. Ethan felt the moment they noticed him before anything was said. The man's expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition of a problem. They had seen him. Ethan shifted his weight, ready to move, but the nearest man was already stepping forward. He was broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, with a coat too heavy for the mild afternoon, and a face that looked as though it had forgotten how to do anything but harden. His hand rose slowly, not in panic, not in anger, but with deliberate certainty. He drew a revolver. The motion was almost calm. The barrel lifted and found Ethan's chest. There was no warning shouted across the clearing, no demand to explain himself, no chance offered. The message was plain enough in the way the man held the gun. Ethan's hand tightened at his side. The distance between them was too short for a clean run and too open for a hidden move. He could feel his pulse in his throat, in his jaw, in the backs of his hands. The air itself seemed to stretch thin. One heartbeat, then another. Everything narrowed to that black ring at the end of the gun. And then the world exploded sideways. A violent impact slammed into the armed man from the edge of the clearing. He shouted once more from shock than pain as the horse crashed into him with the full force of its weight. The revolver flew from his hand and vanished into the leaves. The man hit the ground hard, shoulder first, rolling with a grunt. For one split second, nobody moved. Not Ethan, not the other two men, not even the one on the ground. Then everything broke apart at once. One of the others swore and lunged forward. The second turned toward the horse, reaching for the knife at his belt. The horse reared half a step, breathing hard, eyes wide and bright, but it did not bolt. It planted itself between Ethan and the men, chest heaving, ears pinned, head low. It was not panicking. It had chosen. Move, Ethan shouted, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the men, the horse, or himself. One of them came around the side, trying to get a clear angle. The horse lunged again, forcing him back. Ethan did not waste the moment. He ran. 3 strides. 4. He caught the saddle with one hand, hauled himself up, and swung over the horse's back just as it pivoted hard beneath him. He barely had the reins before the animal launched forward. Branches whipped past them as they hit the tree line. Behind them, men yelled. Someone shouted to shoot. A gun went off. The cracker shattered the silence of the forest, sharp and close. Something hissed past Ethan's shoulder and struck wood somewhere ahead. But the horse did not stumble. It did not slow. It drove forward harder, plunging between the trees, with a speed that felt almost reckless and yet impossibly sure-footed. Go, Ethan barked, though it needed no encouragement. It ran as though it had been waiting years to make this escape. Leaves flew beneath them in dark sprays. Limbs scraped Ethan's sleeves and lashed across his back. He ducked low over the horse's neck, one hand twisted into the mane, the other locked around the reins. Behind them, the voices faded. No one followed far. Either the men feared losing the trail in the forest, or they feared the town more. The horse kept running. It ran until the damp ground began to lighten under hoof, until thin shafts of evening sun started to break through the branches, until the air loosened and the silence of the forest gave way to the dry openness of the valley. Only then did its stride begin to ease. Its breathing remained hard for another mile, but steadier now, controlled. Ethan looked down and realized his fingers were still clenched so tightly around the reins that they hurt. He turned in the saddle and looked back once toward the distant tree line. The horse never did. For the first time since he had bought it, It did not glance over its shoulder. It did not hesitate. It did not pull toward the north or test the reins or tremble under him. It just kept running home. By the time Ethan reached Red Hollow, the last of the daylight was fading. The town looked dimmer than usual, the windows catching only a little weak gold from inside, and the wind had risen again, pushing dust along the street in restless streaks. He did not slow until he reached the sheriff's office. The horse stopped hard in front of the step sides, slick with sweat breath steaming in the evening air. But even now, exhausted as it was, it stood without panic. Its head was up, its eyes clear. Ethan dropped from the saddle and went inside. Sheriff Thomas Hale was behind his desk, sleeves rolled, spectacles low on his nose, reading by lamplight. He looked up at once when Ethan entered. "You look like hell," Hale said. Ethan ignored that. "There's a cabin in the North Woods," he said. "Children inside. Bound. Locked in." The sheriff did not answer immediately. He set the paper down with care and leaned back slightly in his chair. His face gave away nothing, but his eyes changed, measuring, testing, deciding whether this was a frightened man's wild story or something else. "A cabin," he repeated. Ethan nodded. Old structure, hidden in a clearing, smoke from the chimney, door chained from the outside. The sheriff's gaze stayed on him. "And you're certain about what you saw?" "I saw children," Ethan said. "More than one. Tied up. Quiet because they've been scared into staying quiet." Still Hale said nothing. But when Ethan added, "The chains on the outside, they're not being kept in for shelter. They're being kept in so they can't leave." The sheriff's expression shifted. "What direction?" he asked. Ethan answered at once, giving him every turn, every stretch of path, every landmark he could remember. The creek bed, they crossed the broken pine, leaning over the trail, the clearing at the end. Hale listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the sheriff rose from his chair so quickly the wood scraped against the floor. He stepped to the door and called for his deputy. "Get Miller and Wakefield. Bring rifles, lanterns. Wake whoever's closest and sober." The deputy stared. Now. No more doubt. No more weighing possibilities. Only action. Within minutes, a small group had gathered, men pulling on coats, checking weapons, taking lanterns from hooks. No one asked many questions. The sheriff did not give them room for any. He simply told them there were children in the woods and men keeping them there. That was enough. They rode out under full dark. Lanterns and torches lit only fragments of the road ahead, making the night feel larger around them. Hooves sounded dull against the earth. Leather creaked. Metal clicked softly where rifles shifted in scabbards. No one spoke unless necessary. The horse led them. That more than anything unsettled the others. Ethan felt it in the way they looked at the animal as it moved ahead of the group without hesitation, choosing the correct turns where the road gave way to brush, finding the old trail without the slightest pause. It needed no urging, no correction. It knew. As they neared the woods, the air turned colder again. The wind dropped away. One by one, the men seemed to notice the same thing Ethan had earlier, the absence of sound. Even the horses felt it snorting softly, ears shifting. They entered the trees with lantern light swinging low between trunks. The path narrowed. The clearing appeared all at once, just as it had in daylight, and the cabin stood, waiting in the center of it. Only this time, there was more than smoke. There was movement, faint, brief, but real, some shadow passing behind the covered window. Hale lifted one hand, and the group slowed. He pointed silently, splitting the men around both sides of the clearing. Two dismounted and moved left. Another pair circled right. Ethan remained near the center with the sheriff, his heart beating harder the closer they came. Everyone understood the same thing now. There were living people inside that cabin. When the sheriff gave the signal, it happened fast. One of the men ran to the door and seized the chain. He tested it once, then stepped back. "Hit it," Hale said. The first blow landed with a heavy crack against the wood. Inside, something shifted. A muffled cry. Then silence again. The second blow tore the chain loose from its fastening. The metal snapped back against the wall, and the door burst inward. Lantern light flooded the room. The children recoiled at once, shrinking from it, hands raised to shield their faces, as if they had learned to expect pain whenever the door opened. One of the younger ones began crying the moment he saw grown men rushing in. Another simply stared, too frightened, even for tears. "It's all right." Hale said, his voice low, but firm. "You're safe now. You hear me, safe." Ethan stepped inside behind him and stopped. The room smelled of smoke-damp cloth and fear. The ropes around the children's wrists were cut as quickly as hands could manage. One little girl nearly collapsed when she tried to stand and had to be lifted into a deputy's arms. Another boy clung to Ethan's coat with both hands, without saying a word. Outside, shouting erupted from behind the cabin. The remaining men had found the kidnappers. There was a brief struggle, boots thudding, someone cursing, a sharp cry of pain. But it ended quickly. Too many rifles, too many hands, too little room to run. By the time Ethan came back outside, 2 of the men had been forced to their knees with their wrists tied behind them. The third, the one who had aimed the revolver, had blood on the side of his face and murder in his eyes, but no weapon left to reach for. The clearing looked different now. Smaller. Exposed. The secret that had lived here was no longer hidden. While the children were wrapped in blankets and passed gently from arm to arm, Sheriff Hale went back into the cabin with a lantern and began looking carefully through what remained inside. Ethan followed a moment later and found the sheriff crouched near the back wall holding something in his hand. A coat. Old, dust-streaked, torn along one sleeve. Beside it lay a knife in a worn leather sheath and a small metal identification tag, half hidden under a broken board. Hale picked it up and held it toward the lantern. His eyes narrowed. He read the name once in silence. Then again. "You know him?" Ethan asked. The sheriff looked over at him. "I know of him." He turned the tag over in his hand. "Name's Daniel Mercer. Passed through here a month back, maybe a little more. Asked questions about a missing family." Hale looked down at the coat. Folks remembered him because of the horse. Said it was a nervous thing, hard to settle, skittish around noise. Ethan glanced toward the doorway where his own horse stood just beyond the light, motionless. The sheriff followed his gaze. "That horse was his," Hale said quietly. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Hale exhaled and looked around the room once more. "Mercer likely found this place. Likely heard the same thing you did." His jaw tightened. "Difference is he didn't get back out." The truth settled over the room with a weight that needed no further explanation. Daniel Mercer had ridden into the woods alone, found the hidden cabin, and tried to save the children. Somewhere in that attempt, he had failed to save himself. But the horse had escaped. It had run, not far enough to forget, not free enough to lose what it had seen. It had carried the memory back out of the woods into town, into silence, into the hands of men who did not understand it. Until Ethan bought it. Until someone finally listened. Outside, the last of the children had been loaded onto waiting horses for the ride back to town. The prisoners were bound and under guard. Men spoke in low, disbelieving voices, no longer out of fear, but from the shock of what had been uncovered. Ethan stepped out of the cabin and looked toward the horse. It had not come any closer. It stood just beyond the brighter edge of the lantern light, head-level body still. No pounding hooves, no shaking, no frantic glances toward the trees. Just stillness. The sheriff came to stand beside Ethan. For a while they said nothing. Then Hale spoke, his voice quiet enough that it almost seemed meant for himself. "It didn't come back here to run," he said. Ethan kept his eyes on the horse. "No," he answered. Hale nodded once. Came back to finish it. That was the truth of it, plain and strange and impossible as it sounded. The horse had led them here not because it was haunted, not because it was wild, not because it was broken. It had come back because something had been left unfinished in these woods. And somehow, in the only way it could, it had found a man to bring with it. The ride back to Red Hollow was slower. The children were exhausted, some half asleep against the chests of the men carrying them. The prisoners, road-bound, watched from both sides. No one said much. The night itself seemed to have grown deeper, as if the valley were waiting for dawn before it decided what to do with the truth. When they cleared the forest, the wind returned. The horse walked beside Ethan without resistance. At one point, after the others had moved a little ahead, Ethan stopped and turned in the saddle. Behind them, the dark line of the northern woods stretched beneath the stars, silent again. The horse stopped too. For a long moment, it simply stood there looking back toward the trees. But there was no tension in it now. No fear. No desperate need to pull away or return. For the first time since Ethan had laid eyes on it in Carter's stable, the animal seemed completely at peace. Ethan rested a hand against its neck. He understood then that he had never truly been at the center of this story. He had not begun it. He had not uncovered it alone. And in some strange way, he had not even chosen it. He had only listened when no one else had. He had only followed when the horse asked him to. And that had been enough. "All right," he said softly into the dark. "You can stop looking now." The horse did not turn its head again. And when they rode on toward town, it never once looked back. Morning broke over Red Hollow, like it always did, slow, pale, and carried in on wind. But by sunrise, the town no longer felt like itself. Word had spread before the first store opened its door. Children had been found in a hidden cabin in the North Woods. Men had been taken in chains from the same place. And somehow, impossible as it sounded, it had all begun because a half-starved horse no one wanted had led a lone cowboy into the trees. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside Sheriff Hale's office. Mothers stood with shawls pulled tight around their shoulders, whispering to one another with hands pressed over their mouths. Men who usually kept their distance from trouble now lingered in knots along the street, speaking in low voices that rose and fell whenever the office door opened. Some looked horrified, some angry. Some looked like they had not slept, and some looked too still. Ethan noticed that almost immediately. Shock had a look to it. Fear did too. He had seen enough of both in his life to know the difference. But there were faces in that crowd that seemed fixed in a different way. Not stunned, not grieving, not relieved. Watching, calculating. A few people asked him what he had seen. Others only stared at the horse standing beside him, as if they could not decide whether the animal was cursed or blessed. The horse itself remained quiet. It shifted once in the dust, then stood with its head low, calm, in a way Ethan had never seen before. Inside the sheriff's office, the rescued children had been given blankets, water, and whatever food the town could gather quickly. They did not speak much at first. Most sat with the hollow stillness of creatures who had learned to measure every breath. One little boy would not let go of a tin cup someone had placed in his hands. A girl with hair hacked unevenly at the shoulders stared at the floorboards as if she expected them to open beneath her. But by noon, bits of memory began to slip loose. Not in order, not clearly. A deputy knelt at eye level and asked gentle questions. Sheriff Hale spoke softly, more softly than Ethan would have believed possible from a man who sounded like a slammed door most days. The answers came in broken pieces, where they had been taken from what the inside of the cabin had looked like: the sound of boots outside at night, the fear of hearing the chain rattle on the door. Then one of the older girls, perhaps 10 or 11, lifted her head and said in a voice so low it almost disappeared beneath the room's murmur. One of them wasn't a stranger. Every conversation in the room stopped. Sheriff Hale crouched in front of her. "What do you mean by that?" she swallowed. He didn't sound like the others. "How so?" The girl looked past the sheriff toward the window, as though she were ashamed of what she remembered. "He talked like people here." Another child, a boy this time, nodded quickly. "I heard him too. He knew the road names. He knew the town." A silence followed that felt heavier than any shout. Sheriff Hale did not turn toward Ethan right away, but he did not need to. Ethan felt the man's eyes meet his a second later. This was no longer only a story about men hiding in the woods. Someone closer had known, maybe helped, maybe only looked away. But the rot had not begun in the cabin. It had reached there from somewhere else. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the saloon. He told himself he was only there to listen, but that was not the full truth. He wanted to see faces. He wanted to watch who avoided his eyes and who stared too long. He wanted to test the air in the room now that everyone in town knew the North Woods had given up one of its secrets. The saloon had changed overnight. The laughter was gone. The lazy card games had vanished. Glasses still clinked, boots still crossed the floor, but every sound seemed tighter, more deliberate. Conversation stopped when Ethan entered, then resumed too quickly, too carefully. Old man Carter stood near the bar, polishing a glass that did not need polishing. The old man did not look up at once. When he finally did, his expression was unreadable. Ethan took a seat without ordering. Across the room, he searched for the man who had watched him the day before, the one whose gaze had lingered just a little too long when Ethan mentioned the horse. But the man was nowhere to be seen. "Quiet crowd," Ethan said at last. No one answered. He let the silence stretch. Carter turned the glass in his hand. "Town's had a rough night." "That all?" The old man shrugged. "Seems enough." Ethan watched him for a moment. "Funny thing," he said. "People sure do look nervous for folks who claim they didn't know anything." That drew a few eyes his way. Then they dropped again. Carter set the glass down. "Careful where you point that kind of thought." "Why?" Ethan asked. "Might hit something true." No one laughed. A chair scraped somewhere in the back. Ethan rose and stepped closer to the bar. "You lied to me about the horse." Carter's face hardened, but only slightly. "Did I? You said you found it outside town. Said you didn't know where it came from." Carter reached for another glass. "That what's bothering you today? It belonged to the man who disappeared." At that, the old man's hand paused. Only for a beat. Barely long enough to notice. But Ethan noticed. "You knew that," Ethan said. Carter resumed up polishing, but slower now. "I knew a man rode through with a horse. Men ride through all the time. Not many vanish in the woods after asking about missing children." That landed harder. Carter's eyes flicked up, then away. His jaw worked once before he spoke. "Some things are better left alone, son." The words were quiet. Not a threat. Not exactly. More like a confession wrapped in cowardice. Ethan leaned his forearms against the bar and lowered his voice. Children were chained inside that cabin. Carter said nothing. One man already died trying to stop it. How many people in this town knew enough to keep quiet? The old man finally met his eyes then, and what Ethan saw there was not cruelty. It was fear. Old-rooted fear. The kind that took hold over time and made a man decide silence was safer than decency. Carter looked away first. "You start digging through old ground around here," he said. "You'll find more than you want." Maybe that's exactly what needs finding. Ethan left without another word. By the time he crossed the street back toward the sheriff's office, the idea had hardened in him. Whatever had happened in the North Woods had not been the work of strangers alone. The town had fed it somehow through help, through trade, through deliberate blindness. Men did not run something like that near a settlement unless they believed no one would interfere. Inside the office, Sheriff Hale had begun doing what sheriffs did best when instinct turned into certainty. He was making lists. Who had traveled the North Road in recent months? Who had hunted near the tree line? Who had delivered supplies without asking questions? Who knew the old trails? Who had spoken too quickly against going into those woods? By evening, patterns had begun to show. Not enough for a hanging. Not enough for an arrest. But enough to stain names. One of the men taken from the cabin had been seen in town before. Not often, not openly, but enough that more than one person remembered him after being pressed. A hat pulled low. A coat bought in winter. Whiskey paid for with clean coins. He had not been local, but he had not been a complete outsider either. Someone had traded with him. Someone had served him. Someone had watched him come and go and decided not to ask where he went after dark. When Hale told Ethan that he did it without ceremony, he stood at the office window, hands on his hips, staring out at the dimming street. The danger wasn't just in the woods, he said. Ethan looked at the crowd, thinning under the evening sky, at the people moving in twos and threes past storefronts that suddenly looked smaller, meaner, more exposed. No, he said. It was here all along. For a few days after that, Red Hollow lived in a strange half-state between relief and dread. The rescued children began to recover in small ways. They ate more. They slept longer. One or two even spoke without being asked. Their laughter had not returned, but it no longer seemed impossible. The townsfolk, meanwhile, moved through their routines with the awkward carefulness of people forced to share space with truths they would rather avoid. Every conversation felt one question away from accusation. Ethan went back to his ranch. There was nothing else for him to do, or so he told himself. Fence posts still leaned. Water troughs still needed cleaning. Horses still needed feeding. His life, stubborn as weather, tried to resume its old shape. And for a little while, it almost did. The horse was calmer now. It no longer struck the ground at night. It no longer pulled at the rope or threw its head toward the north whenever the wind shifted. Sometimes Ethan would look up from a chore and find the animal standing quietly in the yard, ears loose, body easy, as if some deep knot inside it had finally eased. The cabin had been found. The children had been saved. The men responsible were in cells. The missing rider had been named. That should have been enough. It was not. One night, near a week after the rescue, Ethan stepped outside just before moonrise and saw the horse standing beyond the fence line, facing the north woods again. He stopped at once. The posture was familiar, but not the feeling. There was no panic in it, no violent tension, no rapid breath. The horse simply stood there, waiting. Ethan approached slowly. "What is it?" The animal did not move. It only flicked one ear back at the sound of his voice, then returned its attention to the dark line of trees beyond the valley. A strange certainty slid through Ethan. This was not memory repeating itself. This was intention. "You're not done," he said softly. The horse lowered its head once, almost imperceptibly, then lifted it again. Ethan looked toward the woods, then back at the animal. He did not argue this time. He did not tell himself he was imagining things. Too much had already happened for that sort of lie to survive. He saddled the horse in silence. They left before dawn. The ride into the woods felt different from the first one. The fear was there, but not the same kind. The first time Ethan had been following mystery. Now he was following purpose. The horse found the old trail quickly, then left it. That more than anything told Ethan this was not a return to the cabin. The animal turned east of the clearing, taking a narrower path that barely deserved the name. The ground grew rougher there, cluttered with exposed roots and fallen limbs. More than once Ethan had to dismount and lead ducking under branches, sliding down wet inclines, trusting the horse to pick a way through terrain no sensible man would have chosen. "This better be worth it," he muttered once. The horse kept going. There were fewer signs of passage here. No obvious prints, no bent grass, no broken brush fresh enough to follow. It felt older, less touched. And yet the horse moved with the same steady conviction it had shown before pausing. Only when Ethan needed to catch up, then continuing the instant he was ready. Eventually, the trees opened onto a smaller patch of uneven ground at the base of a rocky rise. The horse stopped. It did not paw. It did not rear. It only stood still and looked down at a section of earth that had been disturbed. Ethan stepped closer. The soil there was rougher than the land around it, turned over clumsily and flattened without care. Brush had been pulled across it in a poor attempt to hide the shape beneath. He felt the cold before he understood why. "No," he murmured. The horse did not move. Ethan tied it loosely to a low branch and found a shovel lashed to a side loop on the saddle, something he had brought out of habit more than intention. Then he began to dig. The work was slower than he wanted. The ground was heavy with roots and stone, and every scrape of metal into dirt seemed to echo through the trees. Sweat ran beneath his collar despite the chill. Twice he stopped breathing hard, staring at the half-open patch of earth as if willing it to prove him wrong. It did not. The first thing he uncovered was fabric, then bone. He stood very still after that one hand, gripping the shovel handle so tightly it ached. By the time he had cleared enough to be certain, he no longer needed any confirmation. The remains were those of a man buried in haste and without dignity. Near the body, half hidden in the dirt, lay what was left of a leather satchel and the rusted clasp of a coat buckle. Daniel Mercer, or what was left of him. Ethan crouched and reached for the satchel with careful hands. The leather nearly came apart under his fingers, but inside he found a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle that had somehow kept part of its contents dry. A notebook. Not intact, but enough. Several pages had fused together. Others were stained or torn beyond reading. Yet one page near the middle still held a stretch of words in faded pencil, written in a hand that had begun steady and ended in haste. Ethan sat back on his heels and read. Found the cabin. Children inside. More than I feared. 3 men, maybe more. Tried the chain. Heard one of them coming back before I could get them clear. Horse spooked when the shooting started. Can't blame him. If I can buy them time, maybe that's enough. He swallowed and turned the page with both hands. The last lines were harder to make out, written at an angle, the pencil dragging weakly across the paper. Can't make it out. Legs bad. Too much blood. Let the horse go. If you're reading this, the horse made it out. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment, the woods vanished, replaced by a picture so complete it might as well have been Memory Mercer wounded in the trees, riding with shaking hands. While somewhere beyond him, the horse fought the reins, desperate and terrified. The decision to let the animal run rather than die there beside him. The last slim hope that someone, anyone, might one day understand what the horse had survived and why it would never stop trying to return. When Ethan opened his eyes again, the horse was watching him, not anxiously, not impatiently, quietly. "You brought me here too," Ethan said. The horse lowered its head. All at once he understood what had been driving it from the beginning. It had not led him only to the cabin. It had led him to the full truth. To the children, yes, but also to the man who had tried before. To the promise left unfinished in blood and fear and silence. This was not gratitude. Not in the simple way people like to talk about animals repaying kindness. This was fidelity. This was memory made into purpose. The horse had not come back to thank anyone. It had come back to keep a dead man's last hope from being buried with him. Ethan wrapped the notebook carefully and took it with him. Then, with more effort than he expected, he finished uncovering enough of Mercer's remains to carry them home. By the time he reached Red Hollow again, the sun had dipped low and turned the valley bronze. Sheriff Hale met him in the road before he even reached the office. One look at Ethan's face was enough. "You found him." Ethan nodded once. The horse did. This time, no one in town laughed at that. Mercer was buried 2 days later on a patch of rise overlooking the valley. There was no grand procession, no preacher from a distant city, no polished coffin lined in velvet. Red Hollow had little talent for beauty and less for ceremony. But a grave was dug properly, men stood with hats in their hands, and the sheriff read Mercer's name aloud for all to hear. Some lowered their heads out of respect, some out of shame. Ethan noticed Carter standing near the back of the gathering hat, pressed to his chest, shoulders bowed in a way that made him look smaller than Ethan had ever seen him. There were other faces there too, men who had been too quiet, women who had known more than they had said. People who now seemed unable to meet one another's eyes. The town did not become good overnight. Places never do. But it changed. Secrets once buried under custom and fear began to come into the open. Not all at once, and not cleanly, but enough. Names were spoken, questions were asked. A few men left Red Hollow before anyone could ask them too much. Others stayed and discovered that staying after the truth came out required a different kind of spine than silence ever had. The rescued children slowly found their way back toward themselves. One of the younger boys learned to sleep through the night. The girl who had first said one of the men sounded like someone from town laughed once at something a deputy said, and then looked startled by the sound of her own voice. Another child still flinched at doors opening too quickly, but no longer hid beneath tables when boots crossed a floor. One afternoon, while Ethan was helping repair a broken rail behind the sheriff's office, a small girl no more than 8 stood a few paces away, with her hands clasped behind her back. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Why did the horse choose you?" Ethan straightened slowly and turned toward the animal grazing nearby. The horse no longer needed tying, needed him. Ethan had stopped using the rope days ago. He left the gate open now, and still the animal stayed near following when it wished wandering, when it wished always circling back without being asked. He considered the girl's question seriously before answering. "It didn't," he said. She frowned a little. "But it led you." Ethan nodded. "I just listened." The girl looked at the horse again, as though trying to understand a language she had almost learned. Then she gave a solemn little nod of her own and walked back toward the office. That answer stayed with Ethan long after she had gone. Because it was true, he had not been chosen in any grand or mystical sense. He had simply been the first man stubborn enough or quiet enough to pay attention when the horse tried to speak in the only ways it knew how. By the end of autumn, Red Hollow looked the same from a distance. Same weathered buildings, same road, same wind. But up close, it was different. The silences were no longer the same. They held less denial and more reckoning. People still passed one another carefully, but some now stopped to speak truths they once would have buried. A town that had lived by looking away had been forced at last to look directly at itself. As for Ethan, he found that the valley no longer fit him as neatly as it once had. Not because he hated it, but because he no longer belonged to the version of himself who had come there wanting nothing new. On a cold morning under a wide, pale sky, he saddled the horse one final time. Not with a tight working bridle, not with the old restraint of ownership, just enough gear for the road. He rode through town slowly. A few people watched from porches. Sheriff Hale lifted a hand once in farewell. Carter stood outside the stable and nodded, his face lined with something closer to regret than Ethan had thought the old man capable of. One of the children waved from the office steps. Ethan tipped his hat, but he did not stop. At the edge of town, he loosened the reins. The horse moved beside him easily, no longer thin, no longer frantic, no longer carrying its fear like a wound under the skin. When the road widened into the open valley, Ethan slipped down from the saddle and walked for a stretch, one hand resting against the horse's neck. He did not turn to look back at Red Hollow. Neither did the horse. Ahead of them lay the long cut of the land, fading gold beneath the morning light. The valley opened into distance. The wind moved freely again, brushing through the horse's mane and tugging at Ethan's coat. They kept going. One man, one horse. No rope needed between them. And somewhere behind them, in a town that would never again be able to say it, did not know the truth remained. Some animals don't just survive. They remember. And sometimes, they come back to finish what we couldn't. Thank you for watching and staying with this story until the very end. If it moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing these stories to life.